Yeah, that's good. Hello. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jocelyn Markowitz. I'm a member here at Central Synagogue, and I'm one of the co-chairs of our community organizing leadership team. Okay. With me is fellow congregant and fellow team member Mari Hinojosa. We are so honored to have with us this evening Professor James Forman, and want to thank all of you for coming out to participate in tonight's event with him. It's wonderful to see how many people are here to share in some learning with such a distinguished leader of criminal justice reform. Please join us in giving a very big welcome to Professor James Forman. So it's our belief that our work in this area should be a reflection of our values, and primary among these is working across lines of difference. So when we come to this work, we do it in partnership with our interfaith partners, other advocacy organizations, and elected officials. In addition to the many central members here tonight, there are some other representatives that we would like to thank for being here. With us is Pastor Jared Stoller from St. Peter's Church. We're joined by lay leaders from Congregation Beth Elohim, as well as Anshe Chesed, B'nai Jeshurun, Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, Brooklyn Defender Services, the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, the Brotherhood Synagogue, Citizens Committee for Children, Drive Change, Exalt Youth, Fortune Society, the Jewish Women's Foundation, Lawyers for Children, the Legal Aid Society, Leo Beck Temples, New York City Lab School, Rodef Shalom, the Sanctuary Coalition, Sharei Tefillah, Stuyvesant High School, Sutton Place Synagogue, Temple Israel, Trinity School, and Vera Institute of Justice, just to name a few. We're also honored that joining us tonight We're also very honored that joining us tonight are Nigel Farina from the Manhattan DA's office, Jason Starr, Assistant Counsel to the Governor, and Jim St. Germain, who was on our BIMA as a teacher during the Raise the Age campaign.
So, to put tonight's event into context, 2.5 years ago, although for some of us it might feel like a lifetime, we launched Central in Action, which is our community organizing initiative here at Central Synagogue. And what we did is we began a series of conversations within Central about the issues that mattered to our members the most. And after literally hundreds of hours of active listening, what we learned is that one of the issues that our community is deeply pained by are the grave injustices of our present state and federal criminal justice system. And so for our first action, we participated in the Raise the Age campaign, where together with a broad-based coalition that included other faith partners, we successfully advocated to raise the age of criminal responsibility in New York State, helping to keep 16 and 17-year-olds out of the adult criminal justice system. Thereafter, and until now, we have focused our efforts on the pressing need to reform New York State's bail system. So as part of this campaign, we've sought to create opportunities like tonight, times that we can come together, we can listen, learn, ask hard questions, and grapple with issues that may not be familiar to us, and even some topics that may make us uncomfortable. You are in this room because you are someone who is willing to engage on the complicated and thorny issues of race, class, bias, and justice. We know that you will approach this material with open minds, spirits, and hearts. And we know that you will have questions, and we welcome them. You've been given index cards and pencils, so please write out any questions you may have, and we'll pass around a basket during Professor Forman's talk. And you can put your questions in the basket, and after Professor Forman speaks, he'll answer as many as time permits. And now, please join us first in welcoming our senior rabbi, Angela Bookdahl, who will share some thoughts on how this work connects deeply with our community's faith tradition.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn and Mari, for your leadership in this. Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all its inhabitants. These words are found on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and it expresses this fundamental American value that there should be justice and liberty for all people. But did you know that our founding fathers were actually quoting the Torah? Did you know that that quintessential expression of American democracy comes from Leviticus chapter 25? The Torah had a foundational belief that all people were created equal, were created in the image of God, and should therefore be given and accorded fundamental liberties. This was actually a very radical idea many thousands of years ago, where ancient peoples and civilizations actually believed that there were people who were human and more human, and then there were people who were subhuman. There were Greeks and there were barbarians, right? So it was actually a radical idea then, but actually it was still a relatively radical idea when our country was founded. When you think about how many countries had class systems and caste systems that were immovable, and where people were either royalty or people who were meant to be servants or slaves, or there were people who were Brahmins and there were people who were untouchables. So this was an idea that was radical, that came from our tradition in many ways. But if you want to know the context of that line from Leviticus, it's actually even more revolutionary than you think, because that line comes from the expression of the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year comes every 50 years, but there's also a sabbatical every 7 years. But in these special Jubilee years, everyone who is enslaved is freed. And if you had to sell your land, your ancestral homeland, because you were indebted, you actually received it back in the Jubilee year. So think of how wild and crazy that was. So this is the context in which the Torah was trying to express that liberty was for all, but it understood that a primary basis for freedom and liberty for all people was some basic economic independence for everyone. That criminal justice, economic justice, and we'll say now racial justice were all intertwined. Because you see, even in biblical times, economic opportunities were not equal, and there was an enormous disparity that only grew and grew between the rich and the poor, so much so that people would become so impoverished that they would become indebted, and oftentimes the only way they could get out of debt was by selling themselves or their children into slavery. Yes, there was definitely slavery in the Bible. And families would also be forced to sell, as I said, their ancestral homeland from the time of Moses just out of desperation. So they lost their vine and their fig tree, so to speak, and many of them lost their liberty. And the result was, over time, a very small number of people would become substantial landowners with great wealth, and then a majority of society would become landless, impoverished, and even enslaved. So this was written, more than 2,500 years ago, but does this sound familiar today? You might be thinking, but we don't have slavery today. Well, yet there are record numbers of Americans in debt, and over a third of them say they don't think they will ever come out from under their debt in their lifetime. 40% of the people, the population in our jails in New York, are people who have not yet been convicted of a crime, but they're incarcerated because they cannot afford the bail required. The vast majority of people incarcerated on Rikers Island, just over there, have not yet been convicted of a crime. They are overwhelmingly people of color, and they are there for nonviolent, low-level offenses, often because they can't afford a bail of less than $1,000. They have lost their liberty because they are poor. So Jewish texts have many things to say about criminal justice in addition to this idea that we all are entitled to liberty. Pidyon Shivuim means freeing the captives, and it is commanded that people who are held in custody unjustly by the authorities need to be freed. According to the Shulchan Aruch, which is our definitive code of Jewish law, it says, every moment that one delays in freeing captives, in cases where it is possible to expedite their freedom, is considered to be tantamount to murder. Now, these are really strong words. They might even seem overly dramatic until we remember stories like that of Khalif Browder, whose family was with us when we tried to raise the age of criminal responsibility. Khalif was charged with stealing a backpack and was sent to pre-trial detention because his family could not afford the bail. He was sent to Rikers Island, where he languished for 3 years before they finally dismissed his case. Traumatized by his experience, Khalif tragically took his own life when he was finally freed. Every moment one delays in freeing a captive where it's possible to expedite their freedom is tantamount to murder. These issues we're discussing today, that our social justice team under Rabbi Stephanie Cohen has been working on for the last 3 years, are not only justice issues. They are not only issues of our democracy. They are also moral issues. They're also Jewish issues. And that's why we're engaging with them here at Central. We are deeply grateful to have a scholar like Professor James Forman here tonight to help us understand this important issue today. And I'm proud to say we believe this is the first time he's ever spoken at a synagogue. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Whitney Tilson. I co-chair the Criminal Justice Initiative here at Central, and it's my great honor to introduce an old friend of mine, Professor James Forman of Yale Law School. I'm going to read this pretty quickly. He has such an incredible background, and I want to let him get up here because that's why you're all here. But I do want to tell you a bit about him. So he started public schools in Detroit and New York before graduating from Atlanta Public Schools. He then attended Brown University and Yale Law School, after which he worked as a law clerk for Judge William Norris of the Ninth Circuit, and then for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. After clerking, he could have taken any job he wanted, but he chose to join the Public Defender Services in Washington, D.C., where for 6 years he represented primarily indigent adults and juveniles charged with crimes. And during his time there, he saw how many of his clients were being failed by D.C.'s public schools, so he decided to do something about it and co-founded the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, which is an alternative school for dropouts and those who have been youth who've been involved with the criminal justice system. And then a decade later, the Maya Angelou School expanded and agreed to run the schools in the DC's juvenile prison. That school, which had long been a failure, has been transformed under the leadership of Maya Angelou's staff, and so much so that the court monitor overseeing DC's juvenile justice system called the Turnaround Extraordinary. At Yale, James teaches constitutional law in a seminar entitled Race, Class, and Punishment, and a seminar called Inside Out, Issues in Criminal Justice, in which Yale law students study alongside men incarcerated in a Connecticut prison. He writes in the areas of criminal justice and criminal law policy, constitutional law, juvenile justice, and education law and policy. His particular interests are in schools, prisons, and police, and the race and class dimensions of those institutions. As if this weren't enough, Professor Forman's first book, entitled Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America, received rave reviews, was on many top 10 lists, including the New York Times top 10 best books of 2017, and was awarded the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. I'd like to end with a personal note. I met James in 2006 when I was starting Democrats for Education Reform, and we quickly connected over our shared passion for improving our nation's public schools, especially for low-income and minority youth. Many of the same injustices plague our criminal justice system and the horrific school-to-prison pipeline. I can tell you from personal experience that James is as decent and kind as he is brilliant, as wise as he is smart, and that no one is more committed to addressing injustice and inequality. I'm delighted that he's taken time out of his busy schedule to be with us today, and I hope you will join me in giving him a very warm welcome. I appreciate it.
Well, after that introduction, I feel like I shouldn't really say, shouldn't even try to talk, because whatever I do is going to be disappointing. I really appreciate it, Whitney, and we have been friends for a number of years, and I've seen your commitment. And I appreciate all of y'all who came together to invite me here. And the team, the social justice, the action team here that contacted me and said, you know, we want to talk about, we're building a movement here, and our synagogue is going to be a central part of that movement. And so I appreciate all of you who have that vision for justice. I think that if you just look around this room right now and just think about the number of people who are in this room, it's powerful. And the power that you have, that we have collectively, of course, is so much greater than the power that any of us has individually. But I can tell you 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I started working on these issues, there wouldn't have been a meeting here. If there had been, it would have been, 7, 10, 15 people. So it's amazing that in this place and in places like it around the country, people are coming together in such numbers. I thought that I would, we all have a story of what brings us to this space. And each of you has a story of what motivated you to be sitting here in this room. And I thought I'd start by telling you something of my story, what brings me here. And I write about this in the book that some of you have. There are a lot of stories in that book, but one that I want to tell you about is of a young man that I represented by the name of Brandon. And Brandon was a teenage client of mine, 15 years old. And we were in Superior Court, Washington, D.C., and he had been charged with and pled guilty to possession of a gun and a small amount of marijuana. And he was facing sentencing. When I was his lawyer, I'd been appointed to represent him. And I had taken the job of being a public defender because I viewed it as the civil rights work of my generation. See, my parents met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They met in the original civil rights movement. And their generation, and when I say their, I'm not going to call anybody out, but for some of you, that was your generation. And so when I say their, if it's you, I'm talking about your generation. Their generation changed and transformed this country. My dad is African American, my mom is white. They're a mixed race couple at a time when those marriages are illegal in many states in this country. And their generation faced down Bull Connor's dogs, marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, went to D.C. 250,000 strong for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. They brought us the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68. I mean, Congress passed those laws, President signed them, but don't kid yourself. The only reason any of that legislation became law was because people fought, and people marched, and people organized, and people sat in synagogues like this one and said, we're not going to stand for it. And yet, and still, right, that generation made it possible for me to have a life unimaginable to a black man in my father's generation. But yet, as I was graduating from law school, I could see that there was unfinished business to this movement. And I'm not saying it's the only place, but the place that I saw the unfinished business manifesting itself out was the criminal justice system. And you'll hear me, sometimes I'll call it the criminal justice system, sometimes I'll call it the criminal legal system. Like more and more people, I'm starting to use the word criminal legal because it feels like there's not enough justices in this system to deserve that title. But in our criminal legal system, when I was graduating from law school, we didn't have the term mass incarceration. That term that many of you take for granted today, that term was created in the year 2000 by activists and advocates trying to describe this phenomenon. So we didn't have the term, but we already knew. When I was graduating law school in the 1990s, we already knew 1 in 3 young black men under criminal justice supervision. Black women, the largest single growing part of this prison system. We already knew that the United States had passed Russia and South Africa in the late 1980s to become the world's largest jailer. We had 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. These things were all known by the 1990s, and I had seen some of the changes and transformation in American society and some of the practices that produced that. So I grew up in Atlanta in a mostly African-American, working-class neighborhood. And I could see disparities. You know, one of the things that being an outsider does, and people in this room understand that, one of the things being an outsider does, it allows you to see injustices and inequality that other people may not notice. And I could see it even as a child. I'm African American, but I'm so light, the police in my neighborhood didn't always know it. So there was a difference in how I was policed when I was by myself versus when I was how I was policed with my friends and when we were together. 2 blocks from my house, as a child, there were 2 enormous buildings. In one direction was a General Motors plant. In another direction was the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. That's when I was a kid. Now I'm graduating from law school, deciding what I'm going to do with myself. And in that time, in those 15 years since my childhood, one of those buildings had shut down, jobs shipped overseas. The other building had built an extra wing, an addition. And I don't need to tell this room which is which. So I wanted to fight that struggle. I wanted to make my contribution to this cause, and that brought me to be in Superior Court, standing next to Brandon, asking for probation. I had a letter from a teacher and a counselor at his school. It was his first arrest. The letters asked for him to have a second chance. His mother and grandmother were there in court. They wanted him to come home. The prosecutor in the case, she wanted him to be locked up. She wanted him to go to a place called Oak Hill. Now, Oak Hill is like a lot of juvenile facilities in this country. It combines a lovely sounding name, Oak Tree on a Hill, with a brutal, brutal, violent reality. It was a place where drugs and violence were common. It was a place where, as a child, you always left worse off than when you entered. The judge had to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker, Superior Court Judge, Washington, D.C., African-American judge. That's not unusual. About 40% of the judges in D.C. were African-American. Now, Judge Walker, that's not his real name. I changed everybody's name to protect identities of my clients. But he was a real judge. And he looks at Brandon, and he says, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you've had a tough life. You deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough, son. Let me tell you about Jim Crow segregation. Judge had been a child in those years, so he lectures Brandon on what it's like. And then he says, so here's the thing, son. People fought, people marched, people died for your freedom. Dr. King died for you. And he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on, embarrassing your family, embarrassing your community, carrying that gun. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you turn it around one day. But today in this courtroom, actions have consequences. And your consequence is Oak Hill. Locked him up. I was so furious that day. I mean, think about it. The judge had just taken that same history, that same decade, those same heroes, and he had twisted it on its head in some sort of kind of, I thought, twisted moral rationalization for why the same heroes that had brought me to be standing next to Brandon, he had invoked them for why he needed to lock Brandon up. But as I began to work through my anger that day, and I'm still in process on it, but as I began to work through it, I began to think about the fact that, you know, the judge wasn't alone. I told you 40% of the judges in Superior Court are African American. The city council that passed the gun and the drug laws that Brandon was being sentenced under, that was a majority black city council. The mayor was black. The police force was majority black. The police chief was black. The chief prosecutor in the city was none other than Eric Holder, before most people knew him. And yet and still, even with that representation in local government, we were doing the same thing in our community. We were passing the same laws, enacting the same policies. We were following the pattern that the country was following. And so I began to ask myself this question: what happened in this country that was so powerful, that was so profound, that was so all-consuming, that even in a majority black community with some measure of control of its local criminal justice system, we were making the same set of choices and with the same results? I told you that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. Nationally in DC, it was 1 in 2. And that was a question. That's the question that was the research kind of underlying this book. I'm going to give you a little bit of the story there briefly, and then we're going to move forward. But let me just tell you a little bit of the answer to the question, because I think understanding the answer of how we got here, including and even in majority black communities, helps us lay the foundation for the question of what are we going to do now? The first thing that we have to grapple with and be really honest and serious about is rising crime and violence and the fear and the anger that it created in this country, and especially in African American communities over the last 50 years, especially in 2 decades, the crack years of the 1980s, early 90s, and the heroin years of the 1960s. And let me just mention something about the 1960s because it's not as well remembered as the crack years. The homicide rate in this country doubled in the 1960s. In DC, it tripled. In New York, it more than doubled. Heroin. They tested everyone entering the DC jail for a decade, still to this day. In 1964, they found that 4% of the people entering the jail were heroin addicts. By 1969, the 4% had become 45%. Now that's an epidemic. And the epidemic created a response from the community. City council members in Washington and in other cities were deluged with letters from citizens. In DC, they were from mostly black citizens. Washington, DC in 1970s was a majority black city, 70% black. They called it Chocolate City. So these are black citizens writing to a majority black legislature. 11 out of 13 members of the initial city council are African American. And these letters reveal a pain and a suffering. People say, we just fought the civil rights movement, but I'm scared to take my kids to school. They're selling drugs on the corner. I'm scared to leave them in the park after school because they're shooting in the park. I feel like a stranger on my own streets. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. And over again, these letters end with some version of do something, do something. You got to do something about it. All right, who's receiving these letters? For me, that's the second important part of the story. The generation of people that is receiving these letters is the first generation of black elected officials to be elected in any number in this country since Reconstruction. 1970s and 1980s, we get an 800% increase in black elected officials nationwide. It's an 800% increase over almost zero, but it's an 800% increase. It's because of the Voting Rights Act of 65. This is in a generation, many of them are from the South. Some of them were in the civil rights movement. All of them remember the long history of under-enforcement and under-protection of the law in African American communities that has marked our existence in this country since slavery. My dad used to tell me about this. He's from Jim Crow, Mississippi, Jim Crow, south side of Chicago. He said, we didn't call the police in our neighborhood, black neighborhood, when there was a crime. The police weren't going to come respond to black victims. And if they did, the only thing you could be sure of is they were going to make matters worse than what they found. They remember Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. And I say Southern, but let's be clear, there's Southern mentality in lots of parts of this country. You see a lot more Confederate flags up north than anybody should be comfortable with. Southern sheriffs, right, they're asked about homicide in black neighborhoods. They said, oh, that's not a homicide. That's another dead black person. And they don't use the words black person. Right, so they remember this history, and now they're in office. They have some measure of control over local government, and they want to make that government respond to those people that are pleading for protection. Okay, crime is rising, people are scared, some elected officials want to provide protection. But why police and prosecutors? Why is that overwhelmingly, and prison, why is that overwhelmingly the response? And here's where the story of what happens in African American communities meshes with the larger story of what's happening around the country. Because black elected officials, right, and black political power has always been local. But anytime you're talking about a minority population, you have to grapple with how it interacts with the larger society. And that larger society over the last 50 years imposed incredible constraints on the ability of local officials to respond to these rising problems of crime and fear and addiction. Let me mention a couple of those constraints. The first one is historical. Black communities in this country lack the resources to protect themselves and therefore are overly dependent on the state. And the reason they lack those resources is because of a history of racism and discrimination in law. Starting with slavery, which, let's be clear, we talk about it as like an episode, it's like a unit. We had slavery for longer in this country than we haven't. I'm not talking about metaphorical slavery. I'm talking about 1619 to 1865 is more years than 1865 to the present. Now, you add Jim Crow and segregation. That brings us to, you pick the year, Brown v. Board, 1954, Civil Rights Act, maybe 1964. So now we're talking about 1619 to 1954. That's 80 to 85% of American history. And the slavery and white supremacy, it's not an abstract term. It's a real term with impact on people's lives. It manifests itself in policy. It manifests itself in decisions about where you can get a loan to improve your house, so black communities now then lack the wealth that many people take for granted because they weren't able to improve their homes over time and their homes never rose in value. Discrimination and provision of benefits, the GI Bill, you go off to fight and you're supposed to get benefits when you come back and black soldiers don't receive them. Decisions about where to build the federal highway system. Decisions that are invisible to us today. But for example, we built a federal highway system in the 1950s and 1960s. We take it for granted today. I'll just mention Atlanta again because I know it best. Who's driven through Atlanta? All right, if you've driven through Atlanta, you've driven on I-85 or I-75 and we're crazy in Atlanta, so it's like 13 lanes in each direction now. You don't know it, but when you're driving through Atlanta, you're driving through the middle of what was called the Black Wall Street. Auburn Avenue, Dr. King was raised in this neighborhood, thriving, robust black middle-class neighborhood, destroyed. The federal highway had to be put somewhere. It was put through the community with the least political power, and it's still suffering to this day. So those accumulated public policy decisions have left communities unable to protect themselves adequately, and so they're over-reliant on police, over-reliant on prosecutors, over-reliant on prisons. The second constraint is political. The people that I'm most interested in studying, black elected officials, are in cities. And local government has a lot, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, has a lot to do in this area. But there are limits to local government. And one of those limits you can see in the book. Black elected officials for the last 50 years have had what I call all of the above strategy to fighting crime and violence. They've said, we want more police, we want more prosecutors. Sometimes, unfortunately, they've even said we want more prisons. But they've also said, we want more money for drug treatment. We want more money for job training. We want more money for education. We want more money for housing and health care. We want national gun control to go alongside the local gun control laws we're passing. We want a Marshall Plan for urban America. We want the United States government to do for cities what it did for Europe after World War II, to rebuild, to reinvest, to revitalize. For 50 years, they have this all of the above strategy. And for 50 years, they come back from Congress with money for one of the above. Law enforcement, police and prosecutors in prisons. The last constraint that I'll mention, and I end with this one, because it's one that I think we all suffer from, still to this moment. And our work, part of our work is to try to liberate ourselves from this constraint. But this is a generation of people, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. This was a generation of people who were constrained by their imaginations and how to respond to what were real and genuine pressing social problems. There are a lot of examples of this, but I'm going to share one. One of the people I write about is a guy named David Clark. David Clark was a city council member in Washington, D.C., 1970s. I told you all that 11 out of 13 members of the first city council were African American. David Clark is one of the 2 white members. Interesting bio. He went to Howard Law School in the 1960s, gets out, works for Dr. King, becomes a lawyer for poor people, and then runs for city council. Now, David Clark is not a drug warrior. In fact, the first thing he does in 1975 when he gets in office is he pushes for marijuana decriminalization. Doesn't pass, but he argues for it. Okay, early 1980s, he's now the chair of the city council. And heroin, I told you about heroin in the 60s. Heroin comes back in the early 1980s, and there's an uptick in letters, people complaining. And now their focus of the letters is on heroin addicts. They say they're gathering in parks, they're gathering on our stoops, they're gathering on street corners. I can't go anywhere without finding dirty syringes. And these letters say, do something about it, do something about it. So David Clark gets these letters. He's a responsible government official. He takes the letters and he forwards them to the head of the relevant government agency. And he gets the letter back time and again. Councilmember Clark, we received your complaint about heroin addicts. We're on the case. That's good. But who does he forward the letters to? Remember, he's not a drug warrior. He's a marijuana decriminalizer. Does he forward them to the Department of Mental Health, Public Health, Addiction Services? Remember, the problem stated in the letter is heroin addicts in public space. Now, he doesn't send them to any of those agencies. He sends them to the police chief. Because even though he's not a drug warrior, he's an American. And like so many of us, his imagination is constrained. He can only think of the problem of a heroin addict in public space as a problem that calls for a law enforcement response, a problem that calls for the city to send somebody whose only tools are handcuffs and a gun, and whose only place they can take you for treatment, where there is none, is the local jail. And when I think about this problem of mass incarceration, one of my central arguments is that it's tempting to, and important to, look at speeches of presidents and acts of Congress. But it is just as essential, I think more essential, that we look at the tiny individual decisions made across 50 states, across 50 years, across the 3,000 counties that make up America. These tiny decisions, many of them hidden from public view, and many of them made by, not all of them, but many of them made by people with good intentions. The tiny decisions like which government agency to enlist for support when you're confronted with citizen letters about heroin addicts in public space. And it's those tiny decisions, I argue, that are the individual bricks that collectively have built the prison nation that America has become. Now, I'm not going to stop there, because this is an action-oriented group of people. So I want to talk not just about how this system was built, but I want to talk a little bit about how we can think about unbuilding it, taking it down, and building something new in its place. So let me start on that by just sharing. It's not a particular policy idea, but for me for me it's a way of thinking about problems like this, and it comes from, and my own role in responding to them. And it comes from a conversation that I had with my mother some years ago. I was in high school. And I went to 10 schools for 12 grades. There's great things about being a child of civil rights activists, but educational stability is not one of them. And I was in a new high school, and it's my second day, and I saw a scene in the bathroom that really bothered me. And I didn't really have the words to describe it at the time, but I mean, I knew it was bullying. It wasn't physical, but it was emotional, and it was real, and it was powerful, and it was about, I later would understand it was about gender identity and the way this one kid was presenting himself and dressing and such. I was distraught, and I went home and I was talking to my mom, and my mom was one of these like all up in the school moms, and so I was like, Mom, this is really terrible, and I had ideas for what the principal could do in response, and the assistant principal and dean of students. I had a set of ideas for what my mom could do to try to move the school. My mom listened to this whole story, and when I was done, she was like, wow, thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you were so honest and felt like you could talk to me about it. She was like, but I just have one question for you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And for me, that's how I try to think about this, which is that when we're talking about a problem this big, it's easy to think about what other people can do. And our work is to think about what we individually and then as a collective can do. So if you think about how this system was built, right, I argue that it was built by these small individual bricks, many of them at the local level. Right? And that means our response overwhelmingly should be local and state. So 88% of prisoners in this country are in state, county, and local prisons, not in federal ones. 85% of law enforcement is state, county, and local. So when we think about what we can do at the state and county and city level, one thing that y'all have chosen to do that I'm very excited about, because I believe that it's a movement across the country that you're a part of, is around this question of bail reform. Right now, and you heard Rabbi talking earlier and shared with you some numbers, just a few more, right? Right now, there's 3,000 people tonight who will sleep behind bars in cages in this city for no reason other than they cannot afford to post bail. For no other reason. And you've heard the Khalif Browder story, right? And the damage that it can do when you're held overnight on a charge. And some of these are very low amounts, $250, $500, $750. But understand this, if you have no money, $500 is $1 million. You don't have it. And these small amounts, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, small amounts, they can be debilitating and destabilizing even if they don't lead to a Khalif Browder situation. You lose your job. You're disconnected from your kids. You have to find alternative child arrangements, and if you can't, you may lose your kids to state custody. The basic daily functioning of life that so many of us take for granted is ripped away from you, and you're placed in an institution of isolation and violence, and where you're treated with contempt. And the thing to understand, that's so important to understand, is there's such little to no public safety rationale behind this. Understand this just for a minute. Khalif Browder couldn't get out of jail, and his crime was stealing, alleged crime, charged crime, was stealing a backpack. Now, you can be charged with the most serious crime in the world. You can be charged the next time you look at the news and you want to look at some high-profile person. Harvey Weinstein, you can be charged with incredibly serious, the most serious crimes we have. And you can be out that night if you have money. So it cannot be about safety if you can walk out the door if you're rich. It just cannot be. And it cannot be about safety if you are held behind bars in a cage on something minor because you are poor. Now, they'll tell you, they'll scare you to make you think that it's about safety. But that's what they always do whenever we try to push back in any arena and to make the criminal legal system more just. They said it when you try to reduce prison population. But New York State's prison population has been reduced 28% over the last decade, during which time crime in the state has decreased over 20%. And it's not just true in New York. It's true in New Jersey. It's true in Connecticut. It's true in Texas. It's true in California. They said if you let people out of prison, then all of a sudden crime is going to go up, and it hasn't. It's gone down. And y'all know this in this city better than any others, because for a decade you were told that if you didn't have the most rampant, outrageous, civil liberties violating stop and frisk program in the country, that New York was going to go back to those terrible days of the late 1970s. And then people mobilized and people organized and people filed lawsuits and ended stop and frisk, and crime has continued to go down. So Be prepared for the scare tactics, but be prepared to respond to them with numbers and with data and with stories. I'm not going to y'all are going to spend a long time over the next year focusing on, I hope, many of you are going to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort focusing on the particulars of the bail reform proposals in this state. I'm just going to say a couple things at a broad level about what I think you should be committed to, and I think this is consistent with what this congregation is already committed to. But whatever form it takes, please make sure that bail reform has to do three things at an absolute minimum. It has to end wealth-based incarceration. It cannot be the case that you are in prison only because you are poor. Full stop. If it doesn't do that, it's inadequate. It has to reduce racial disparities. You can't buy into a system that's going to bring a whole lot of algorithms and other things, risk assessments that haven't been adequately validated and haven't been adequately tested. And when they have been tested, we've learned to incorporate a lot of racial bias and have those substitute for the current system of racial bias. If we fall for that, then just consider yourself warned right here, December 10th, Central Synagogue, do not do it. And the third thing is, it's got to decarcerate. We have to, the whole purpose of this, or a core purpose of this, is that we have too many people locked up in this country. We have more people in jail right now. Jail, not prison. Jail, which is where you go pre-trial or for very short sentences. We have twice as many people in jail as we had in prison in this country 40 years ago. Just in jails. So we have to, with a laser focus, be dedicated to reducing the number of people. So if the new system that we fight for isn't going to reduce the number of people who are behind bars pre-trial, then it's not a system worth fighting for. I know y'all are going to be focused on bail, but I have to share just a couple of other ideas and passions of mine in thinking about responding to mass incarceration. And one of them, Whitney alluded to a little bit, but I want to say something else about it, which is education. Education has been one of my life's passions. For a long time, I was focused on kids in the juvenile justice system and trying to keep kids from becoming my adult clients, and that remains a passion of mine. But for the last few years, I've been focused on another piece of this, which I want to talk with you just for a couple of minutes about, and that's education for people who are incarcerated. The research on this, a lot of times in the social justice movement, we have like aspirations and we have dreams, but we don't always have the data to back it up. And this is an area where the data is unassailable. The RAND Corporation has studied the issue, and for every dollar that we invest in education for people who are incarcerated, we as a society receive $4 to $5 in return. And that's because employment goes up. If you get an opportunity to be educated, you're more likely to be working when you get out. Recidivism goes down. You're less likely to be pushed into a situation where you feel compelled that you have to commit another crime. But even just put those to one side for a minute and just think about what draws me to the issue, which is the moral component. So I teach a class, Whitney made reference to this, I teach a class on the criminal legal system. It's called Inside Out, Issues in Criminal Justice, and we meet in a Connecticut prison. And I decided to teach the class because I was thinking about my mom's conversation a few years ago. I was thinking about the fact that, I'm writing this book and I try to do what I can, but the main thing that I do is I teach. That's my main job. And so what can I do in my domain of control, in my sphere of influence? What can I directly do? Even if I can't change national policy today, what can I directly do to respond to this injustice? And I decided it was to take my classroom and move it inside a prison. So I teach the same material that I used to teach at Yale Law School, But now I teach it in a Connecticut prison in the fall semester, and I teach it in a women's prison, a federal prison, in the spring semester. It's a seminar setting, 20 people in a circle, 10 of them incarcerated, 10 of them not. Studying, debating, arguing, analyzing, disputing texts, disagreeing with one another. And most importantly, though, breaking down the bonds of isolation and the stereotypes that have come to define those who are incarcerated. Because I think fundamentally, one of the reasons why we've been able to create this enormous prison system and so few people have cared or paid attention is because we've demonized and we've stigmatized those who are incarcerated. We've labeled them. So we don't think about them as human beings with the capacity for growth and curiosity and the desire to learn. They're an undifferentiated other. And we forget about them. But what Inside Out does is it disrupts that entirely. And it proves the humanity of people that otherwise we would have written off. And for the incarcerated students, it's been equally profound. One of them wrote at the end of last semester, he said, I like the law and the policy that I learned in this class. But most of all, what I liked, more than anything, is I liked that for 2 hours a week, I would enter the seminar circle and I would walk into a space where I was treated like I was smart. And I was treated like I was important and had something to say. And I was treated like, and on some days it even made me feel like an intellectual. And I want you just to think about, I don't want to minimize the structural gaps that divide who gets incarcerated from from people who end up as students at Yale. But I think you all know through maybe how you were raised or how you've aspired to raise your children or raise your grandchildren. What he's describing, being treated like he was smart, being treated like my son, he takes that for granted. That's an everyday, every minute experience of his life, right? That he has something to say. It's like, you need to say less, man. But we know, right, because we have raised our children in that way, and there's a reason for that, because we know the liberation and the power and the agency that is created when a person is treated like they have things to contribute. I have other ideas of policy levers that we can pull and activism that you could get involved with. If I had time, we could talk about employment and the power those of you that work with or for companies have to become fair chance employers. If we get a chance, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But because my time is drawing to a close, and I know we're going to have some time for question, I want to just end with not a policy idea, but another way of thinking about this problem and this struggle that you all engaged in. And I told you all a story of my mom earlier, so I can't sit down without sharing a story of my father. We had watched a movie a couple years before he passed away. We watched a movie about the civil rights movement. And when it was over, I said, what did you think of the movie? You were there. And he said, well, I liked how they showed this history in film because more people watch films than read books. So it's important that they put it in film. I probably should have thought about that part of his story before I became an author instead of a filmmaker. But what he went on to say is the main point of the story, which he said, here's what I didn't like about the movie. He said, what I didn't like about the movie is he said they made it seem like everybody was in the movement. And he said it wasn't like that. He said we were unpopular. We were few in number. He said when I used to go on college campuses to try to recruit kids to join the civil rights movement, administrators ran me off campus. Parents didn't want their kids leaving college to join the movement. He said Martin Luther King was unpopular when he died. I mean, there's a Gallup poll, 2/3 unfavorable ratings at the time of his death. The March on Washington, He said the March on Washington was unpopular at the time it happened. They asked Americans 2 months before the March on Washington, do you think this march will help or hurt the cause of the Negro? I'm talking about, y'all, the same march that you see on continuous loop on Black History Month. That march, 60% of the people said it will hurt the cause of the Negro. And then there were 250,000 people there at the march. I mean, that's a big number. But a decade later, 10 million people were like, I was there. And this is what my dad's point. My dad's point, he was saying, he said, I'm not pointing this out to you because I want credit for being someplace before other people were there. He's like, that's not what is important to me. And if you knew my dad, you would know that was true. He said, I'm telling you this because I think that these portrayals are demoralizing to your generation and to the future generation. Because you call a meeting about an issue that you care about, and there's 6 people at the meeting, and 5 of them were at the last meeting, and you're like, but in the movement, everybody was there. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. That is my dad's point. And so what my dad said was, look, when you are fighting an injustice that is so powerful and so profound and so all-encompassing and so seemingly entrenched as slavery or Jim Crow, or I would say in this context, mass incarceration, he said, when you're fighting that, people are going to tell you that changing it is impossible. If you ignore them, and only if you ignore them, and you march and you fight and you mobilize and you defeat it, the same people that told you it was impossible are going to turn around and say, oh, yeah, defeating that was inevitable. And then they're going to make a movie about it. So I don't know the idea that's in this room or the group of people that is in this room. It's going to, the exact idea. Bail reform is going to be a piece of it, I think. But there'll be other pieces. And I don't know precisely who in this room is going to carry the work forward in ways that are above and beyond anything that I can dream of right now. But I know that you're here. I know the people are here, and I know that the ideas are here, just as the people and the ideas were present in previous generations. And so what I know is that if you ignore everybody that tells you that you're never going to change the bail laws, and you're never going to close Rikers, and you're never going to end mass incarceration, what I know is that if you ignore them and you continue to march and rally and call your legislators and go to Albany, you are going to win, and you are going to take down this system, and you're going to replace it with one that actually protects communities without all of these destructive and toxic effects. A system that restores and responds to harm without brutalizing people. A system that actually deserves to be called a criminal justice system. And when you do that, they're going to make a movie about you. And I'll be in the front row, popcorn in hand, cheering. Thank you.
That was amazing, and you, Professor, gave us a ton to digest and profound words to think on. We did set aside some time for questions, so I know some folks have had a chance to send them up. Please feel free to continue to write questions on the note cards that you have, and you can just maybe hold it up, and our staff, wonderful central staff, will continue to circulate picking up questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So maybe we'll just start with one that sort of touches on something you talked about, which is the sort of let's call it the media, public, elected official reception to any idea of like letting more people out of prison or out of jail, which is, well, there's going to be more violent criminals on the street, and the like implication of that is, well, if there's, if one bad thing happens, it wasn't worth letting out all of those people, is really the unsaid, unspoken thing. How do we respond to that? How do we counteract that, especially for electeds and the media, like the New York Post?
Yeah. Well, I think that, so part of the response I suggested in the form of data and numbers, right? In pointing out to people that we have and are successfully reducing prison populations and we are seeing crime go down. Right? That's part of the story, but that's only going to be, those numbers are only ever going to work as part of our response. The other thing I think that we have to do, there's sort of two things, and they involve stories, and one is historical and one is present day. So on the historical side, we have to start educating elected officials about, and my book is in part an attempt to do that, about mistakes that previous generations made in times of crisis and the lasting implications of those decisions. I just came from Jessup Prison in Maryland. I spoke a few days ago. And when I was there, I met a group of guys who all of whom are incarcerated, and almost all of whom are incarcerated for murder, and all of whom have been in prison for 30, 40, 50 years. I'm talking to guys who are in their 50s, 60s, one guy's in his late 60s. They were all sentenced at a time by judges who thought they were going to get parole. Because at the time, you could get, because their sentences allow for parole. It was life with parole. And in fact, one of them, the guy who was in his mid-60s, he told me how his sentencing judge had said, I want you to remember this day and this victim. When you get out, I want you to dedicate the rest of your life to trying to create a safer community, and never forget this day. Well, this guy is in. He's in 20 years beyond what anybody thought he would be. And why is he there? He's there because in 1995, Paris Glendening, a Democratic candidate for governor, was not going to be Willie Horton. And he said, he stood outside Jessup, that prison where I was, on the lawn, in front of a bank of cameras, and he said, if I am elected governor, life will mean life. You will not ever be released. And in Maryland is one of those states that a governor, even if the Board of Pardons recommends it, the governor has to sign off. Since that day, no lifer, since 1995, no lifer has been released from a Maryland prison, except for one guy who was like, there was a technical error and they had to. It was mandated by courts. And so what we have to do is we have to help. And now Paris Glendening now says, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. And if I were in elected office, I would work to fix this problem. So what we have to help elected officials see is that when they make these kinds of pronouncements, they can have an impact that is long beyond what they could ever imagine, is number one. And the second thing we have to do, and I'll be briefer here, is we have to arm ourselves. You know, people talk about how this movement has to be led by and incorporate the voices of the families and people who have been most directly affected. But people say that, but not that many people really take that seriously and really ask, what does it mean to take that seriously? I think that right now, one of the things that we have to do is we have to aggressively invest in the organizing potential, the leadership potential, the public speaking potential, the advocacy potential, the writing potential of this huge universe of people right now who is out of prison or coming out of prison and want to be. Not everybody who comes out of prison wants to be a justice reformer. People have the full range of human desires, but some people do. And so what we need to do, those of us that have access to those kinds of trainings and those kind of opportunities, is we have to help this group of people develop the skills so that they can be the most effective voices, because the most powerful response, right? The most powerful response. Like I just told you the story of these guys in Jessup, but it would be more powerful if the guy I was talking to was standing right here, telling you the story. And we have people like that, but we have to help equip them to be leaders in this movement because it's their voices that are going to present the human face to this issue.
Professor, we have a couple of questions here about an issue that's very close to home, literally and figuratively, which is Rikers Island. How do we shut down Rikers Island? Can we shut it down without transferring the violence to community jails? And a follow-up that I think is a related question, how problematic is the fact, and how does this relate to the fact that the prison system is now a multi-million-dollar industry?
Yeah. So, you know, there's a level of granularity I think that is going to be required to the precise question of how you shut down Rikers. That I'm not a New Yorker, and I haven't followed the Rikers debate closely enough to be able to say, well, here's the piece of legislation that you should get behind, or here's the person you have to persuade. I do, so I don't know that. I do know that at least it feels to me like it's a movement that had a lot of visibility about a year ago. It felt like there were a lot of marches, there was a lot of public protest, and it seemed like it was making a difference. It seems like it was moving politicians to really take this issue seriously. But I feel like, again, this is from an outsider's perspective, it feels to me like that's died down a little bit. And I guess the only thing that I can say is that it will not happen without sustained and continuous public advocacy. Because Rikers, even though it's so close to New York City, is built to be forgotten. The people who are there are built to be forgotten. So it's only going to be if we continue to raise the issue, I think, that it's ever going to close. The particular policy lever that you need to pull to make that happen, I'm not really sure. In terms of the violence, I don't want to minimize the issue, but I do think we have to start to become honest about how much violence we have created through the institution and through the ways in which we've protected people who run it in very violent ways. And we've allowed the prison guards at Rikers to be largely unaccountable. And so we've set up a system in which people, many of whom come from, have been exposed to violence as children, are put in a situation where they're almost propelled to violence, and then they're being, the people that run the institution are engaged in violence themselves, are not held accountable for that violence. So I don't know the exact percentage. I don't think anybody could prove it, but a lot of the violence at Rikers is violence that Rikers creates.
There's a lot of good questions here, and people are thinking very big and deeply. So I'm going to slip in two different topics. So one is, as a sort of public tactic for changing the policy, your opinion on the RFK Foundation mass bailout, and then totally switching gears, your reaction to how the country is responding to the opioid epidemic, particularly in the light of what you talked about with heroin and crack through the 60s into the 90s.
Yeah. Does anybody have the numbers readily available on the mass bailout? Daryl, Darnell, have either of you all kind of focused on that issue? Because I thought I had read that it was a tiny percentage, or anybody else, a vanishing low percentage of people who have been bailed out, who have either failed to return to court or been rearrested. Does anybody have that number?
Yeah, the New York Times wrote a story citing similar statistics to that. It was 120 people. I don't want to misspeak. It was something like 100 or 120 people.
We think about 120 people.
Who were bailed out, and I thought, at least from the story that I read, I don't have the number in my head, I thought it was an astonishing success in the sense that all of these people were bailed out, and people said exactly what I talked about earlier. They said, well, if you do this, everybody's going to go and commit crimes, and a tiny percentage did. And we also know from this research, not just from the mass bailout, but of the bail funds more broadly, over 95% of people who have been bailed out using one of either the Brooklyn Bail Fund or the Bronx Freedom Fund or the Liberty Fund of New York, right? These are revolving funds. You make a contribution to them, and they respond to this problem that I just described, right? People have $500, right? $500 bond, they can't post it. Now you can apply to one of these bail funds and you get the $500. And the beauty of them is the revolving funds, because when you return to court, the money is deposited back into the fund. And over 95% of people who have been bailed out using those funds generally have returned to court. And so to me, it just shows how obscene and horrific because the system is predicated we need to impose this on you to ensure that you return to court. But in a lot of jurisdictions, most people are released on their personal recognizance. They're released on their personal promise to come back to court, a promise that's backed by a warrant that will issue if you don't. And in DC, where I practiced, which had all the problems that I talked to you all about earlier, but one thing that DC did very, very well is had much, much lower rates of pretrial detention, because we had a different bail. We didn't and don't have cash bail. And so as a result, many, many more people got out. You couldn't be held on bail because if you couldn't afford to post it. And so I think those systems show you don't need to have the system we have. And so the mass bailout, I think, is a very high-profile way of showing people how unnecessary the current system is. And then your other question was?
How we're doing on opioid versus previous drug.
So here's the thing the differential response to heroin and crack, and then now to the opioid epidemic, right, is obviously and powerfully racialized. That is to say, in the 1980s, when the drug was crack, and the villains were mostly African American, at least in the public imagination, although then later research would come out to show that that crack wasn't even a drug that was, most crack users were not black, but that was the public presentation and understanding of the drug. And because of our racialized narratives and implicit and explicit bias, right, we did this extraordinary level of punishing and punitive criminalization with ever longer sentences, people getting 10, 20, 30, 40 years on drug cases, many of them still in federal prison and in our state prisons, but one of the places this was worse was in our federal system. And now, at least rhetorically, there's a much more humane kind of response to the opioid epidemic when the face of the users is disproportionately white, and in many cases, middle class, or at least borderline middle class. Families that the average, that the news media understands their readership as connecting to. It has been more humane, and that's because of race. But I also think, and this is one of the powerful ways I think that race and class both play out in our system, even though we haven't over-criminalized and over-punished in the opioid epidemic the way that we did in the crack years, it's also true that we haven't had anything close to the adequate public funding for treatment that poor and working class people would rely on. So the Republican Party, right, in 2016, including our current president, ran on a campaign of we were going to be more understanding and more sympathetic and sat in clinics with families. But when they got into office, one of the first things they did was to push for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which is the legislation that provides over 80% of the new funding for drug treatment for poor people in this country. So it was a lie. It was a fraud, like a number of other frauds, but it was a fraud on the American people. So, and that's because of class, right? That's because that's because poor and working class white people, while they're not villainized in the same way, right, and hated in the same way that black people are also very, very poorly treated and taken for granted and used and exploited as voters, and their racial fears are preyed upon. But then the thing that they actually need, which is treatment, is taken away from them at their moment of greatest crisis. And then, to help them not notice that, we go back to the racialized fears and we gin those up to try to hold on to their votes for the next election.
I'm getting the time signal, so we just want to thank you again, and as we do that, we'll invite Rabbi Cohen up for some closing thoughts.
I want to, on behalf of this room of beautiful faces and open hearts, thank you so much for the teaching that you've done here. I know every time I speak to you, I come up with a new title, Professor Dr. King of all things, James Forman. You say, call me James. And I just have to say, you taught tonight, and we are so grateful for what you put into this room and what you guided us towards and inspired us towards in this work that we are so deeply engaged in. You really elevated and inspired tonight. So thank you so much. We're so grateful to you. Yeah. A few closing pieces, so I'll ask you not to step out just yet. I know that's the inclination, but we will end on time. I want to thank Rabbi Buchdahl. Thank you so much for leading and teaching us this evening how powerful it is to be grounded in Torah. To Jocelyn and Mari, who have envisioned this engagement and education opportunity for us and throughout this entire year. The Central in Action leadership team, which you'll find scattered around this room, including Jonathan and Whitney and Amy, who have put in so much time to make this evening happen as well. Our central staff MVP, Ali Singer, who is somewhere here, but we are so grateful for the staff who pulled off this complicated and powerful evening. Certainly our interfaith and organizational partners who are here in force. We are so grateful and can't wait to keep working with you. Our policymakers who are here tonight, thank you. We look forward to holding you deeply accountable in the next steps. And of course to you, each of you who have showed up here with just open hearts and a readiness. So we have learned, in fact, a great deal tonight. And no doubt our minds are buzzing together with questions and tensions and truths and complexities. And our hearts are open and raw and full, and for many of us, ready. The issues that we've learned about tonight are not just, as you know, things that we want to be intellectually aware of. They're not one great program that happened on one powerful night. This night is part of our work to bring about justice, to heal suffering, and to repair our world. As you know, Central in Action, our congregation's community organizing justice initiative, is working with other congregations and as part of a multi-faith coalition on a bail reform campaign in this legislative cycle, so that
People are not sitting in jail waiting trial just because they are poor, so that we can reduce racism in our system and so that we can decarcerate in the state of New York. And we know, all of us know, sitting here, that these things don't and won't happen just because they are right. And they don't happen just because we want them to. They happen when people who are committed to a more just and compassionate society act powerfully together with our elected officials, holding them accountable to making real, meaningful, and effective change that benefits our state as a whole. That is what we do in partnership across lines of difference. That is how we live our values in the public square. We act strategically and powerfully and from a place of deep love, grounded in Torah, to make a difference in the world and in the lives of real people, many of them the most vulnerable among us. There are 2 moments in the year ahead where we will have the greatest capacity to make a difference in bail reform this year. The first is in the governor's budget, in the state budget, which will wrap up and be delivered around April 1st. That's the first point of impact. If it doesn't happen there, we'll have the rest of the legislative cycle to try to pass a standalone bill where we can make real meaningful bail reform happen. And that'll wrap up around the end of June. Professor Forman's teachings, along with other experts here in the room and in the coalition with whom we participate, they're helping us shape our strategy. In the weeks ahead, if you want to, you will hear from the Central in Action leadership team about how you can be part of this work. So you should right now have in your hand what we call an interest card. Yes? Fantastic. It's great when things work as they should. If you would like to be kept in the loop on these issues, there will be other opportunities to gather here and in our friends and brothers and sisters congregations and organizations. If you want to know about those and or if you want to take part in the actions to make a difference, we want you to fill out that card. If you're a Central member, we're going to ask you to fill in that top information and then all that apply. Yes, I want to know about actions, events, gatherings on these issues. Yes, I would be willing to write a letter or an email or make a phone call to my elected officials. And yes, I would in fact be willing to go to Albany or locally visit my elected officials to advocate on behalf of the issues we've talked about tonight. If you are not a Central member, okay. So we really want you to fill out that top, and then in the notes section, tell us what you're going to do. We want to be in this with you. We want to be in this with our own congregation, and we want to be in this with our partners. How are you going to bring this home to your congregation, or what is your organization doing where we might be able to participate with you? Also, not on that card, if you're a Central member, we hope you will deepen your learning by joining us as we all do this deep trip to the Deep South, April 11th to 14th, to the Equal Justice Initiative through Alabama, and we'll hit Atlanta. We will drive that road. We will think of you. We hope you'll join us there as well. After this evening concludes, in just a moment, Professor Forman enthusiastically agreed to do a book signing in the atrium. You'll want to go through that open door to be a little face-to-face with our teacher this evening. Kibitz a little, maybe ask a question, get a book signed, buy a book. In a moment, I'm going to invite back Rabbi Buchdahl to come and lead us in a closing song after you've had a chance to fill out your cards. One more piece of instruction. As you fill them out, turn to a person near you that you did not come with. Share with them your name. Tell them what you're signing up for and to do. Ask them what they will sign up to do, and maybe even tell them why you're going to do it. And in a minute, we're going to sing ourselves out.
All right, we're going to conclude. I want to close with song. And to help us do that, if I could actually ask all the members of the COLT team, the Central Organizing Leadership team, to come up here with me. And if I could also ask Professor James Forman to join us. And everyone has been thanked except for Rabbi Stephanie Colin, who leads us in this work so amazingly. And I want to thank you for your leadership. So I think as we are reminded, is there anything more deeply important than a sense of being able to have freedom? I think it's our deepest human desire. And so we believe as Jews that we all know what it was like to be a slave, and we also know that there's a God that redeems. But in Judaism, we only are redeemed as a collective. There's no such thing as individual salvation in Judaism. So if we want to be redeemed, we have to actually have an ability to redeem everyone with us. So if we're going to be saved, everyone is going to be saved. So join me with this. This is an old one. I'm going to invite you to all sing. It goes like this. Oh, freedom. Try that. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Now you have to reach for it. Oh, freedom over me. Try that. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free, and be free. That's it. Oh, freedom together. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. So I think it'd look better if we all stood up and actually joined each other a little bit. Just connect to the person that you're with, and we'll do it one last time now that you really know the song. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. May it be so. Amen. And thank you, everyone.